Before we get into this video, I want to add a bit of a disclaimer. When covering the debate between Mosab and Ramazan cited a particular incident involving a church in Gaza, which Gaza's Christian community were sheltering in. And reportedly, one of the older Christian women left the church to use the bathroom, and she was shot by gunfire. Some say it was by, the accounts differ between, was it a sniper shot, was it gunfire? Most people say it was the IDF. It's almost kind of drawn conclusively that it was the IDF. Apparently, her daughter rushed to help her and she was also shot. Now, this was cited as an example of, if what Mosab, Ramazan was citing this as an example of, Israeli atrocities. And certainly it was one that presented as one that didn't really fit into the comfortable defences of Israel's conduct in war. It seemed like gratuitous killing. And it certainly sounded like these women did not need to die at all. Their deaths should have been avoided, they could have been avoided, they should have been avoided. And worse, from a distance it gives the impression that they were shot seemingly for no reason. Out of sport, perhaps. Now, I'll try my best to look into the case. Now, there are some who try to give the counterexample. Do we know it was the IDF? The IDF themselves say that they've investigated and found no evidence that anything happened at all. So could it have been made up or fabricated? Moreover, could it have been, an incident which a Palestinian militant faction killed these women? Now, I did say in my video that as much as I'd like to believe that's true, not in the sense I'd like it to have happened, but in this, I'd like to believe that's the neat explanation for it that exonerates the IDF of any evil doing here. I'm inclined to think if it was a Palestinian militant group, they would not have just stopped with the mother and her daughter. They would have probably massacred the church. Now, it is possible, since looking into this, I've seen, how the IDF operates. It is possible that the IDF shot at such a distance that they couldn't tell the difference between civilian and combatant. It could have been a mistake. An understandable mistake from a distance, in the face of a difficult, hostile terrain, laced with, treacherous booby traps and everything. And Hamas's kind of ambush modus operandi. Now, during my investigation, something very, very curious came up, in which this video was shared by Middle East Eye.
اللي عم بيقولوا انه مرت خالي وبنت خالي كانوا رايحين سوا ماشيين مع بعض ورايحين على الحمام وتقنصوا. الحقيقة مش هيك. الحقيقة انه مرت خالي كانت رايحة على الحمام وقنصها القناص ببطنها.
Now, Middle East Eye is, of course, very, very pro-Hamas propagandist. It's very anti-Israel propaganda. And in it, one of the, allegedly, someone claiming to be one of the relatives of the two killed women describes what happened.
لما وقعت بالأرض وصارت تستنسجد حاولوا الموجودين مع أولادها أحفادها خالي الناس الموجودين معي مساعدتها ركض أول شخص، قنصوا عليه ورجع هرب. ركضت للأسف بنت خالي سمر لبدها تساعد أمها. تخيلوا حالكم أنتم محطوطين بهيك موقف. اللي صار إنه بنت خالي ركضت لتساعد أمها، ما كانت رايحة مع أمها على الحمام، أمها كانت لحالها وهي كانت لحالها. ركضت لتساعد أمها، القناص قوصها براسها. يعني القناص الإسرائيلي الغاشم الحقود كان واقف ناطرين لكل واحد يطلع يقنصه ويقوس عليه ويقتله بدم بارد.
Now, on the face of it, this looks like a Christian woman, or this looks like quite a westernized woman who probably is possibly part of the minority Christian diaspora in Gaza. But the problem is, some of her language against the IDF is not only against Israel and the IDF is not only inflammatory.
رجعوا ركضوا ليساعدوا سمر الشهيدة البطلة سمر، ويساعدوا الشهيدة مرت خالي، لأنها كانت بعدها عايشة مرت خالي.
But the use of terms like martyred to describe what happened doesn't really fit.
ضربوا عليهن قذيفة، ما اكتفوا بالتقنيص، ضربوا عليهن قذيفة. اللي تجرح منهن، واللي تأذى منهن. وتراجعوا. ضلت مرت خالي تنزف حتى الموت، ما قدروا يساعدوها. هي الحقيقة مش عم بيقولوا بالغلط اللي عم بيدافعوا عن إسرائيل. بابا روما فاتيكان اللي عم بيدافعوا عن إسرائيل، ما تقولوا بالغلط. الحقيقة إنه كل إنسان عم بيتحرك بغزة، كل إنسان عم بيتحرك بفلسطين عم بيقتلوه، مش عم بينطروا يعرفوا هذا مقاوم، هذا إنسان بريء، هذا إنسان مدني.
You know, martyred is the kind of terms I would associate with the Palestinians who support Hamas, who revere Hamas, and certainly revere the mission statement of Hamas, or if not Hamas, then other Palestinian Islamic groups. Christians don't. I mean, Islamists tend to go for this martyrdom idea far more than Christians do, and usually martyred is a term you use when you're describing someone who's been killed as part of a cause, as part of a struggle. Now, if these women were killed by accident or killed out of malice, and who had wanted nothing to do with the war against Israel, then it wouldn't make sense to describe them as martyred. The language suggests that she is certainly very pro-Hamas. You know, long before this happened, you know, the words like martyr just seem to trick off her tongue to describe what happened, which just sounds very, very odd to me. Now, does this mean that the incident was made up? Possibly. Yeah, was it made up by kind of vindictive Palestinians who support the Hamas cause and want to create the illusion that the Christians are dying in this cause as well, and saying, why won't the Pope speak out? Which itself is odd. It's like, why would Christians be calling on a Catholic figurehead to speak out on their behalf? Doesn't quite make sense. Now, it could be that this incident with the women did happen, but maybe not as she described it, because there's a possibility that this woman has nothing to do with the family. She's just claiming to be a relative and telling this story just to stoke more anti-Israel sentiment. Because nothing else is adding up. The use of the term martyred is not adding up. Something fishy is going on here is what I'm saying. And the more fishy it gets, the less convinced I am that this incident happened as described, if it happened at all. So, there's just one last video to watch, the more recent Cenk versus Mosab interview to watch.
This is not the end. We still have lots of work to do. The most significant assassination that I'm looking for is the assassination of Ayatollah, the head of the snake.
It was legitimate to kill over 30,000 civilians while you were trying to get one terrorist, and Netanyahu's 30, 40 times the terrorist Sinwar is. By your logic, you're saying it's okay to kill 30, 40,000 innocent Israelis just to get Netanyahu. The minute they move those settlers into Gaza, you'll know for sure that this had nothing to do with self-defense. All of it was an excuse.
Oh yeah, this is Chenk's great theory, of course. The great theory that when Israel removed the settlers from Gaza in 2005, it was done with this master plan to wait 19 years and then for something for a war to kick off and then move them back in. Then wage war so that they can move the settlers back in. Ridiculous.
To steal more Arab land.
People like Cenk, they are living in a conspiracy theory, alternative reality. Palestinian is not limited to Gaza. Palestinian is a syndrome, it's a mental illness. And Cenk is the perfect example.
Okay, so you would like me to respond to a guy who just escaped from a mental asylum?
You are a parasite, a bottom feeder. This is the problem that we have dealing with scumbags like this.
What is wrong with you people?
Yahya Sinwar is dead. The mastermind of October the 7th and the architect of the war that followed has spent a year in hiding as Gaza crumbled around him. Israel says he died a coward. Many others say he died a martyr, fighting in combat fatigues until the bitter end. That cult of martyrdom is part of the multi-generational radicalization that Israel could now face long after the war ends. But how and when this war ends is now the most important matter at hand. Should Sinwar's death be the moment for Israel to declare victory and end the bloodshed? Or should Israel fight on to finish Hezbollah and neuter Iran? To debate this, I'm joined by Cenk Uygur, the host and founder of the Young Turks, and by the former member.
Isn't Pierce forgetting something? The hostages. You know, it's not job done until the hostages are brought back home.
Of Hamas and son of its co-founder, Mosab Hassan Yousef. Well, welcome to all of you. Let me start with you, Mosab, if I may. Obviously, a hugely significant development in this war that Yahya Sinwar, the architect of October the 7th, has been killed. But how significant do you think it is?
It is significant. Hassan Nasrallah's assassination was significant. The most significant assassination that I'm looking for is the assassination of Ayatollah, the head of the snake, who has been funding terrorists all over the Middle East to destabilize the region, who sacrificed Iranian children. He sent thousands of Iranian children to sweep minefields during the Iraqi-Iranian war. And he gave them keys and he said, this is the key to heaven.
Khomeini had mobilized this force when the country was attacked by Iraq. Iran faced almost certain defeat because Iraq had far superior weapons, many of them supplied by America. So the revolutionaries took tens of thousands of young boys out of schools, put them on buses and sent them to the front line. Their job was to walk through the enemy's minefields, deliberately blowing themselves up in order to open gaps that would allow the Iranian army to pass through unharmed. It was organised suicide on a vast scale. This human sacrifice was commemorated in giant cemeteries across the country. Fountains flowing with blood-red water glorified this new kind of martyrdom.
Then after that, he sacrificed Gaza children. He sacrificed Lebanon. He sacrificed Yemen. He is willing to sacrifice the entire world to satisfy his political ambition. This is the head of the snake. Sinwar was a great success. I will not cry for Sinwar's assassination. I was very pleased that simple soldiers who risked their lives since the beginning of the war got him finally by accident. Then you see the politicians around the world trying to take credit for Sinwar's death. It's a milestone. It's behind us, but this is not the end. We still have lots of work to do, and we cannot afford letting Iran get away with their crime. Because if we allow them, they are going to repeat another massacre. This time it was Hamas. Next time it's going to be a new name.
Iran is the snake's head of this. And the most unforgivable part of this is that Iran was mostly on its knees whilst Trump was in power. He actually enforced heavy sanctions on Iran and on UNRWA. He enforced sanctions on UNRWA. He cut Western funding for UNRWA. He isolated Iran and had it bankrupt. Hamas were almost, which meant that Hamas were far more powerless, far less powerful. With Biden resuming funding to Iran and being desperate to keep Iran sweet, it's that thing with these figures like the Ayatollah are only as powerful as they're allowed to be, and what Biden did was embolden their power by lifting sanctions, unfreezing billions of dollars to the regime. The Iranian regime became more powerful, and so did Hamas, and so did Hezbollah, and so did the Houthis. And that's frankly unforgivable. I just do not know how Biden can sleep at night knowing all that blood is on his hands. That he deliberately reversed a sensible policy Trump enacted. I mean, look, there are policies Trump enacted that are horrible, that I would not condone for a minute. You know, Trump's reversal of Roe versus Wade. You know, his willingness to turn a blind eye when the Turks invaded Iraq and Syria and massacred the Kurdish resistance. That was sickening. But at the same time, the Biden administration has been so rotten. You know, Trump's policies were spot on, and he's reversed the best of them. And the consequences have been terrible. I mean, the worst thing about what he's done is that he's so betrayed Israel so publicly, treated Israel with a kind of disdain as, you know, you're just as bad as your enemies, that it's almost kind of, you know, red meat bait to Israel's enemies, saying, you know, that this alliance is no longer as solid and ironclad as it used to be, so you now can attack Israel without fearing major retaliation from America. You know, so that's just encouraging further aggression, further war, further killing. Biden has allowed Iran to go off the chain, and he can never be forgiven for that. And the worst thing is, when Trump gets into power, he's got a lot of work on his hands to try and undo the damage done, and I'm not even sure the damage done is reversible. I'm not sure the damage done can be undone, because once that perception of America, once the hat trick, once the magic trick is spoiled about, you know, the strength of American kind of, you know, impregnability of, you know, the the US-Israeli alliance, once that's broke, once that perception is gone, then it can't be. How do you recreate that sense of a how do you recreate that deterrent once the illusion of it has been exposed as a facade by Biden? And the worst thing is, you know, it sends a message to every ally of the West, that America is no longer a reliable, strong ally. So it just jeopardizes what little global stability exists. What little global security, global stability exists in the world. It's unforgivable, frankly. And the worst symptom of this is that, how Iran has become a much more powerful player in the Middle East. I mean, I'm not saying Saudi Arabia is a good player in the Middle East. It hasn't been, but it has. I'm not saying Saudi Arabia is much better, but at least Saudi Arabia is willing to come to peace with Israel. There's some hope and progress there.
Okay, Cenk, that is obviously the perspective from the other side. What I was struck by Sinwar's death was that he was hiding in Rafah, which is the very place that Israel have been urged by everyone, including yourself, not to go and attack, not to go into. And yet there is the head of Hamas, there is the person who ordered October the 7th. He's there. Does that not justify Israel's strategy in going in there?
No, not at all. I'm going to answer that in a second, Piers. But you asked a really important question about does the end of Yahya Sinwar and Hassan Nasrallah mean that this should come to a close? That's the central question. And here they have no more targets left. All of Hamas leaders are dead. All of Hezbollah's leaders are dead. In fact, Israel just bragged that they killed the whole new set of leadership of Hezbollah. So if all the leadership is dead, what are we still doing in Gaza? What are we still doing in southern Lebanon? And so the minute they move those settlers into Gaza, you'll know for sure that this had nothing to do with self-defense. All of it was an excuse to steal more Arab land.
For God's sake. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. All right, and it withdrew its settlers as well. So, Israel didn't want the Gaza anymore. Why is this suddenly this conspiracy that Israel suddenly does want the Gaza? That it withdrew from the Gaza with a plan to later come up with an excuse to go back into the Gaza? And then fostered Hamas as a proxy to later give them an excuse to go into Gaza. Just this undying notion that there must be other ulterior motives behind this war other than what Hamas did is just... I just don't get it. It's flat on its face obvious why Israel has had to wage this war to get the Hamas leadership and to recover the hostages. It's just the most... It's just, it's just the height of obtuseness to pretend that can't be the only reason. That can't be the reason, even. And I think this perception about, land grabbing, I mean... It was the UN that drew up partition plans in the formation, in 1947. That was the UN's partition plan for the land. And bear in mind, the partition was to accommodate a huge refugee overspill from Europe of refugees from the Holocaust, Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, who were kind of waiting in Cyprus and in refugee camps. It was appalling. In some ways, it was like Gaza, actually. Like Gaza today, in terms of the starvation, the disease, the hunger. But, Israel was quite content to exist as it did. It was quite content to take the partition plan. The Arabs were not. It's just this ridiculous idea that Israel must be out to claim land. It's, there's no charitable idea that in wars territory gets claimed, and it's claimed for territorial purposes if you're surrounded by hostile forces. There's no ulterior motive to conquer. It's ridiculous. And no one talks about the Jordanian kind of land grabs in 1948 when it claimed the West Bank. And it requires downplaying the fact that Israel has given away land for peace many, many times. I thought Cenk, was an expert on the fact that Israel has made peace deals through giving away, land for peace. So that he can turn around and still make this about, Israel as this land grabber, and it's just It's so disingenuous and offensive, frankly.
So let's be absolutely clear about that. So in terms of Sinwar being in Rafah and this whole Israeli propaganda about, oh my God, they use the civilians as human shields. First of all, we found out and reported by both Israeli and American press that the Israeli soldiers literally use Palestinians, including children, as human shields that they put in front of them to do the booby trap thing that Mossad just explained. It's Israel that did that in this war and in earlier battles.
Right, okay. I'm going to be honest. I used to think that the human shields excuse, justification from Israelis was a bit hoary. I mean, the problem, of course, with human shields is it's been Hamas's modus operandi for decades. Even before they took power in the Gaza, was they did tend to operate from civilian areas, and so that when the IDF had tried to counterattack it, often their live fire did end up killing civilians in the process. But like anything, if the same justification is given again and again for decades, it begins to sound like an excuse. Unless you actually know the conflict. I mean, maybe there are situations in which it has just become used as a blanket excuse that doesn't really stack up with the facts or details. But I know that it happens. I know that, I've listened to the phone calls of, IDF, making, phone calls to, residents of the Gaza Strip and saying, look, we're going to have to bomb this building because Hamas are operating there. You need to take your children and take your family and evacuate because we're about to bomb in about half an hour. You need to leave now. And I mean, there was one recording I actually saw in which the residents actually, the guy they phoned actually said, well, go on and bomb us then. May Allah, the world will curse you for it. We curse you for it. And
تمام يا ابو يونس.
احنا ابعاد عن البنك، احنا بعاد عن البنك.
اسمعني هذا خطير. يطلعوا من البيوت ويبعدوا كمان نص كيلو. كمان الختياريه وكمان الاطفال. هذا بعيد، القنبله حتكون كبيره.
يا حبيبي انا بقدرش اطلع كل الناس هذول انا بدي اقل شيء ساعتين عبال ما كلهم يطلعوا.
يا اخوي لو ما بتطلع انا بطوح.
انت طخ اللي بدك اياه سويه، اللي بتنزل الارض وتطلع.
واحد لازم يعمل كل شيء منشان ما تموت.
احنا
عندك مسؤوليه على الاطفال.
بدنا نموت، كل الاطفال لازم يموتوا.
لا سمح الله بدك تستشهد
عشان تبين بشاعتكم. الله يلعنكم. اللي بترمي السما تتلقى الارض. سووا اللي بدكم اياه.
He was just this really nasty, belligerent scumbag, but it seemed to be a completely brainwashed Islamist. And he even said it at the end, we do not want the peace that comes from you, which just showed how unreasonable and insane these people are, and how deep this devotion to this strange idea of martyrdom runs. It runs deep.
Hamas and Hezbollah have said they intend to kill every Jew and wipe out the state of Israel. If you had your way and there was a ceasefire now, there would be more pogroms and more slaughters of Israelis. The Israelis do not want to kill Palestinians in Gaza. It's the last thing they want. Hamas have made the Gazans into not just human shields, but cannon fodder. Hamas shoot Gazans when they try to find safe areas. Hamas are in tunnels for their own safety. Not one shelter has been built by Hamas in all the time they have ruled Gaza for the Palestinians under bombardment. The only reason that Israel is having to bombard Gaza is because they cannot get at the infrastructure of mass terror and genocide which has been put underground.
I mean, it is scoffed at the claim human shields. It kind of just becomes it feels like just a euphemism for, like, to the mind of the average pro-Palestine activist, human shields is a euphemism for indifference. It's a euphemism for, we don't care to protect the Palestinians. We don't care about their lives. They're just in the way. And we value their lives so little that we're happy to just gun them down. It's like the idea that, why do the Israelis kill Palestinians? Because they don't value their lives. It's indifference, at best. At worst, now some will say at worst it's a racial hatred of the Palestinians. It's a kind of racist society brought up to see Palestinians as inferior. And there's a problem to be gotten rid of. When you when you kind of frame that alongside settler violence against and persecution against Palestinians, it looks like a racism. It looks like a kind of a deep racism. Now, for those of us who have kind of taken Israel's side, I think the reason why we've weighed it up is, well, look, maybe it is indifference, but indifference is not the same thing as the Palestinian murderous intent, the death cult, the belief that is actually it is worth dying in the process of killing Jews as a passageway to get to heaven. That's far worse than indifference, if you know what I mean. And it is a far worse racism. It's a far worse racial hatred. I think in the past I would have said, I would have probably thought, well, look, I'm not entirely sure I'm convinced that if Hamas are kind of invading themselves around human shields, that, you can't wait until they've inveigled themselves from that, and, can't you pass up the chance to kill them rather than take the shot that's going to kill civilians? The problem is October the 7th changed my view on that and made me realise that actually it is imperative to eliminate Hamas at all costs. Because if you don't, then one day they're going to come back. If you pass up the chance to kill them then, they're going to come back and kill you, kill your people in their thousands one day. Because that's just how much of a killing machine Hamas are. That's how committed they are to killing Jews for the glory of their God. And the worst thing is, the attempts, the international community's attempts to stop Israel's war effort is actually forcing Israel to rush this job in a way. It runs the risk of forcing Israel to now have to rush the job even more. It's the strangest thing where I think the international community's supposed humanitarian interests are actually making this war far worse. They're risking making this war, the waging of this war, far worse.
They shoot, according to 100 American doctors that returned, they're shooting the Palestinian children in the head. An extraordinary amount of headshots. They burned them alive, and now they're starving them in northern Gaza.
Okay. I need to address this, actually. Now, this is going to get difficult. This is going to get really difficult. What is he talking about? Well, he's talking about something that has been cited by Owen Jones.
The Israeli army is deliberately shooting little Palestinian children in the head and in the chest. Let's start with a piece in the New York Times by Dr. Feroz Sidra, who is a trauma and general surgeon who worked in the European hospital in Khan Yunis in Gaza earlier this year. His article is based on the testimonies of 65 US-based doctors, nurses and paramedics who served in Gaza. He reports volunteering in Ukraine and Haiti, but states that what stood out about working in a hospital in Gaza was this, and I quote, "Nearly every day I was there, I saw a new young child who had been shot in the head or the chest, virtually all of whom went on to die, 13 in total. He'd concluded that this must be the work of a particularly sadistic soldier located nearby. Then he returned home and spoke to an emergency medicine physician who had worked in a different hospital in Gaza 2 months before. Dr. Sidwa told him, "I couldn't believe the number of kids I saw shot in the head." To the doctor's surprise, the physician said, "Yeah, me too, every single day." Dr. Sidwa worked with the New York Times to poll 65 healthcare workers about what they'd seen in Gaza. 44 doctors, nurses and paramedics saw multiple cases of preteen children who'd been shot in the head or chest in Gaza.
Okay, we're going to have to look at this. Here it is. 65 doctors, nurses and paramedics, what we saw in Gaza. Now, I'm not going to read the whole article, I'm just going to read the stuff that's pertinent to what Cenk just said. Ferozi Sidwa, a trauma and general surgeon who worked at the European hospital in Khan Yunis, Gaza for 2 weeks in March and April. He says, "I worked as a trauma surgeon in Gaza from March 25th to April the 8th. I volunteered in Ukraine and Haiti, and I grew up in Flint, Michigan. I've seen violence and worked in conflict zones, but of the many things that stood out about working in a hospital in Gaza, one got to me. Nearly every day I was there, I saw a new young child who had been shot in the head or the chest, virtually all of whom went on to die. 13 in total. At the time I assumed this had to be the work of a particularly sadistic soldier located nearby. But after returning home I met an emergency medicine physician who had worked in a different hospital in Gaza 2 months before me. I couldn't believe the number of kids I saw shot in the head, I told him. To my surprise he responded, 'Yeah, me too, every single day.' As you can see, these are the x-rays. An enormous amount of information about the extent of the devastation in Gaza has been gleaned from satellite data, humanitarian organisations and Gaza's Ministry of Health. However, Israel does not allow journalists or human rights investigators into Gaza outside of a very small number of embedded reporting trips with the Israeli military, and stories from Palestinian journalists in Gaza have not been read widely enough, despite the incredible risks they take in reporting there. But there is a group of independent observers who have seen this war from the ground day after day, volunteer healthcare workers. Through personal contacts in the medical community and a good deal of searching online, I was able to get in touch with American healthcare workers who have served in Gaza since October the 7th, 2023. Many have familial or religious ties to the Middle East. Others, like me, do not, but felt compelled to volunteer in Gaza for a variety of reasons. Using questions based on my own observations and my conversations with fellow doctors and nurses, I worked with Times Opinion to poll 65 healthcare workers about what they had seen in Gaza. 57, including myself, were willing to share their reasons. Using questions based on my own observations and my conversations with fellow doctors and nurses, I worked with Times Opinion to poll 65 healthcare workers about what they had seen in Gaza. 57, including myself, were willing to share their experience on the record. The other 8 participated anonymously, either because they have family in Gaza or the West Bank, or because they fear workplace retaliation. This is what we saw. 44 doctors, nurses and paramedics saw multiple cases of preteen children who had been shot in the head or chest in Gaza. Dr. Mohammed Razul Abu Nuwar from Pittsburgh. One night in the emergency department, over the course of 4 hours, I saw 6 children between the ages of 5 and 12, all with single gunshot wounds to the skull. Nida Enji from New York. Pediatric gunshot wound patients were treated on the floor, often bleeding out on the floor of the hospital due to a lack of space, equipment, staff and support. Many died unnecessarily. God. Dr. Mark Perlmutter from Rocky Mount. I saw several children shot with high velocity bullet wounds in both the head and chest. Dr. Irfan Galaria. Our team cared for about 4 or 5 children ages 5 to 8 years old that were all shot with single shots to the head. They all presented to the emergency room at the same time. They all died. Rania Afane. I saw a child who had been shot in the jaw. No other part of his body was affected. He was fully awake and aware of what was going on. He stared at me while he choked on his own blood as I tried to suction the blood out with a broken suction unit. Dr. Kawaja Ikram in Dallas, Texas. One day while in the ER, I saw a 3-year-old and 5-year-old, each with a single bullet hole to the head. When asked what happened, their father and brother said they had been told that Israel was backing out of Khan Yunis. So they returned to see if anything was left of their house. There was, they said, a sniper waiting who shot both children. Dr. Aliyah Katan. I saw an 18-month-old girl with a gunshot wound to the head. Dr. Nadal Farah from Ohio. I saw many children. In my experience, the gunshot wound was often to the head. Many had non-curable permanent brain damage. It was almost a daily occurrence to have children arrive at the hospital with gunshot wounds to the head. Times Opinion sent questions about the experience of these American healthcare workers to the IDF. Spokesperson responded with a statement that did not directly answer whether or not the military had investigated reports of shootings of preteen children or if any disciplinary action had been taken against soldiers for firing at children. The statement began, "The IDF is committed to mitigating civilian harm during operational activity. In that spirit, the IDF makes great efforts to estimate and consider potential civilian collateral damage in its strikes. The IDF is fully committed to respecting all applicable international legal obligations, including the law of armed conflict." It all seems pretty damning. You know, it's a hard task for me to defend this at all if true. When I say if true, I mean, what do I mean by if true, though? Well, I say if true because obviously these are, all we know is that, you know, all that we're told, rather, is that children are being brought in with gunshot wounds. We don't know the circumstances in which they got a gunshot wound to the head. We don't know if it was the IDF. We don't know if it was Palestinian militants. We don't know if it was stray bullets. We don't know if it was targeted. This is kind of an after-the-fact report, but I mean, the consistent kind of theme of my videos and my stance has been, who do I stand with? I stand with Israel, by which I mean I stand with the Israeli people who suffered that horrific terror attack on October the 7th. I'll never forget the suffering that and the evil that they endured on that terrible day. Now, when it comes to the government and the military, it gets a bit kind of cloudier, but forced into a position where I have to stand with the military and government because it's only the military and government. They're the only ones that are protecting Israel from this existential threat of Hamas. So even if I would say, well, look, you know, I can't always stand with any state or military on everything, there's not really anyone else I can stand with in terms of, you know, the protection of the Israeli people. You know, the UN certainly aren't interested in protecting Israel. So when it comes to Hamas versus Israel, it's obvious I'll side with Israel. When it comes to the left versus Israel, well, the left are on Hamas's side. They're on Iran's side, in fact, some of them really are on Iran's side. Who mean to destroy the Israeli people. So I have to stand against the left. You know, there's no kind of two ways about it. There's no one else to stand with but Israel. When it comes to the UN versus Israel, after what was exposed about UNRWA's involvement with the UNRWA's involvement with Hamas and the October the 7th terrorist attacks, I mean, it's just the grotesque absurdity of a supposed humanitarian organisation assisting Hamas in a terrorist attack that started this war and led to this entire humanitarian crisis in the first place. that's just, it's baffling to me. And to me, it's what taught me that the UN is a far more malevolent organisation than I thought. And frankly, the more I've researched the makeup of the UN, the design of the UN, the more I feel like an idiot for ever believing anything else. The UN is exactly what the UN is basically a racket of predominantly rogue states and dictatorships, and it's engaging in its lawfare against Israel because it's made up of vindictive dictatorships being vindictive, using lawfare to enact petty grudges rather than being genuinely interested in addressing injustice and bringing about peace. This war has exposed just how rotten and petty, unbelievably petty and vindictive the UN truly is. When it comes to scumbags like Max Blumenthal, if he retweets things, or Owen Jones retweets, information like this, I tend to be inclined to disbelieve the information, but also I've seen the character of Max Blumenthal on Twitter in a way I never have before, and I've seen what an absolute poisonous snake he is, and how loyal he is to the idea of Iran destroying the state of Israel. Just his contempt for the Israeli victims of October the 7th. I feel like an idiot for not seeing what a absolute scumbag he is until now. And I mean, the thing is, of course, usually it's, well, what's the reason he's like that? Well, I think what's been proven is that a lot of journalists, particularly who are against Israel, a lot of them are grandstanding narcissists, slimy narcissists who just, adore the cult of personality they have as being rebels. And this is nothing new, really. I mean, Noam Chomsky was kind of the same. He was an ideologue who spread some unforgivable misinformation about the war in Bosnia in the 90s and the Milosevic's campaign of genocide against the Muslim population of Bosnia. And he did it for ideological reasons rather than any commitment to the truth. Now, when it comes to doctors in Gaza and NGOs, I mean, it's strange. This is not the first time I've kind of heard fishy tales from Gaza.
Dr. Nick Maynard, who's a consultant surgeon in Oxford, regularly works in Gaza with medical aid for Palestinians and joins us now. Thank you for coming on, Doctor. The last time you were at Al-Shifa, how would you describe it then, and what are you picking up from sources and contacts as to how it is today? Good morning to you.
Every single part of the hospital has been destroyed. The whole infrastructure of the hospital has been destroyed. When I spoke to Marwan yesterday, he told me there were 107 patients still in the hospital, 60 medical staff. God only knows what has happened to them. I think we've seen some of the pictures. Surgeons I know have been executed in the last 48 hours there. Bodies have been discovered in the last 12 to 24 hours who have been handcuffed, with their arms behind their back. And so there is no doubt at all that multiple healthcare workers have been executed there in the last few days.
You believe executed by whom, Doctor?
By the Israeli Defense Force.
I was struck after what was exposed about UNRWA and the presence of Hamas in Al-Shifa Hospital. And you have to think, well, why are the IDF so determined to attack this hospital? And the main reason they are is because A, Hamas operate from there, B, there's a possibility the hostages are there. Gaza is a very, very surreal place, really. Now, Nick Maynard was interviewed on LBC about about working in Gaza, and he just dismissed out of hand, in a kind of very kind of disdainful, vitriolic way, dismissed out of hand the very idea that Hamas would ever have operated from the hospital he worked in.
Without exception, every single one has responded to say they have never witnessed any Hamas militant in the hospitals they have worked in. My own experience, and I can only talk about my experience at the moment, I've never seen Hamas militants. When I was there in Al-Aqsa Hospital for 2 weeks, I saw no evidence of that. My multiple trips to Shifa Hospital over the years, I have never seen any evidence of Hamas militant activity. And also, it's worth saying, my access to every single part of those hospitals has been unrestricted throughout all the years I've been going there. And the other thing to say is the evidence that the Israeli Defense Force has put forward to demonstrate the presence of Hamas militants is not remotely credible. And I'll quote 2 pieces of evidence. Back in early November, they showed a photograph of what they claimed was a Hamas tunnel leading directly into Shifa Hospital. And I recognize that as a ventilation shaft next to a hotel I stay in Gaza City. The second bit of evidence that I'd like to quote, and again, there's been multiple examples of this, they showed an MRI scanning unit in the Shifa Hospital with a load of weapons in there, putting that forward as evidence as an arms store. Now, an MRI scanner relies upon a huge magnet to work, and the idea that people would be storing metal guns next to a giant magnet is not remotely credible as evidence of that being used as an arms store. So no, they provided no evidence.
And he denied that there was even a tunnel there. Even though we've seen evidence of tunnels, plenty, on Twitter. The entire infrastructure underneath the hospitals, underneath the Gazan cities, underneath the cities of Gaza. When he said that, I was it did perplex me. I thought, why? Because it was like either he's lying or the IDF are. And I don't think the IDF are lying. And I think he's just determined to just deny everything. And it was like, why though? Why is he lying? What does it serve him to lie? Now that, he was interviewed in Britain. He is far away from Hamas. So, it's not like he's, and Gaza's being devastated. So it's not like he's jeopardizing his medical career in Hamas by, if he did speak out about Hamas's, conduct in the hospital, but he just denied it outright. And this is when someone actually linked me to a site called NGO Monitor, Medical Aid for Palestinians, which Dr. Maynard works for. And just a few points made here. It says it claims to be an independent, non-political, non-sectarian humanitarian aid organisation that works for the health and dignity of Palestinians living under the occupation and as refugees. Funding from the United Nations, chiefly UNICEF. UNOCHA. So it is basically it gets its funding from the UN, and we now know how corrupt the UN are. MAP is a UK charity claiming to work. Oh, wait a minute. On October 2002, MAP accepted the proceeds of a book, After the Terror, which argues for the legitimacy of Palestinian terror attacks against Israeli civilians. In November 2008, received proceeds from an anti-Israel Christmas campaign organised by Jews for boycotting Israeli goods. In 2009, enjoyed the profits of 7 Jewish children, a play that was publicly condemned for anti-Semitic undertones. MAP is a UK-based charity claiming to work for the health and dignity of Palestinians living under occupation and as refugees. It promotes distorted and false narratives and demonising rhetoric under the guise of medical expertise and scientific fact. Presents political analysis, legal declarations and speculations regarding Israel's military operations and weaponry, far beyond the scope of any medical expertise it might possess. Let's see. In March 2019, the Charity Commission for England and Wales warned MAP that it must take care in heeding regulatory guidelines, following a complaint that portions of the money raised by the Palestinian organisation are being used towards political propaganda rather than for its stated purpose of providing medical aid. What's this? In 2019 to 2021, MAP granted $300,000 to the Abdel Shafi Community Health Association, formerly known as the Red Crescent Society for the Gaza Strip, as part of the programme, enhancing prevention and protection responses to acutely vulnerable women and girls survivors of GBV in northern Gaza. Oh, wait a minute. ACHA was founded and is directed by senior members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Other employees have demonstrated support for Palestinian terror groups and their actions. On multiple occasions, the PFLP held events at ACHA facilities. MAP utilises highly biased and politicised language, accusing Israel of indiscriminate attacks and collective punishment against the Palestinian population, while alleging that Israeli defensive measures are arbitrary. MAP organises fact-finding visits together with the Council for Arab-British Understanding lobby group to disseminate an anti-Israeli narrative to British parliamentarians, journalists, EU politicians. In July 2022, MAP and Kabu led a delegation with members of parliament to witness how policies of systematic discrimination and fragmentation imposed upon Palestinians wherever they reside in the occupied Palestinian territory are severe detriments to their health and dignity. The delegation met with the Jerusalem Legal Aid and Human Rights Centre, Palestinian Medical Relief Society, Al-Haq, Military Court Watch, Defence for Children International, Palestine, and Breaking the Silence. In August 2022, MAP was the signatory on a statement condemning the decision by the Israeli military to designate 6 Palestinian NGOs as terrorist organisations. According to the statement, these Palestinian civil society organisations provide vital services to Palestinians living under occupation. We call on the UK government to uphold its legal and moral duties to the Palestinian people, support Palestinian civil society as its institutions are targeted by Israel's repressive measures. In April 2021, MAP signed a joint statement welcoming the decision of the International Criminal Court, ICC, to launch of a formal investigation into alleged war crimes committed by Israel in the state of... Wait a minute, no. In the state of Palestine. The statement condemned the UK's opposition to the ICC investigation, stating that the investigation is the first genuine hope that alleged perpetrators of the most serious crimes will be held to account for their actions. Okay, here's this. On January 2021, MAP, alongside a number of Israeli, Palestinian and international organisations, issued a declaration headlined, "Israel must provide necessary vaccines to Palestinian healthcare systems." The NGOs falsely claim that Israel has legal obligations to ensure that quality vaccines be provided to Palestinians living under Israeli occupation and control, while altogether ignoring that Palestinians residing in Jerusalem are part of the Israeli healthcare system, that under the Oslo Accords the PA is responsible for healthcare of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and that the PA has adopted its own vaccine policy for its population. In June 2020, to mark 13 years since the start of the Gaza closure, MAP, alongside Al-Haq, Al-Mezan and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, launched an online resourcing campaign for the lifting of the Gaza closure, calling for a genuine solidarity movement that will allow us to create the political will and address the root causes of Palestinians' rights to deprivation in Gaza. The campaign admitted that the blockade was implemented in an effort to stop Palestinian terrorists from smuggling of weapons and rockets into Gaza that would later be used to target Israeli civilians. In March 2020, MAP, Al-Mizan and Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights published a report titled Chronic Impunity, Gaza's Health Sector Under Repeated Attack. The report dealt with 2018 protests along the Israel-Gaza border, yet ignored and whitewashed the context of Hamas terrorism, repeated assaults on Israeli civilian communities, and attempted to sabotage the border fence and infiltrate into Israel to commit violence. The report refers to Saji Misher as a first aid volunteer for Palestinian Medical Relief Society who was killed by the Israeli security forces during confrontations in the southern West Bank district of Bethlehem. The report neglected to mention that Mizar was a comrade of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a terrorist organisation designated as such by the by various countries. Mizar's funeral procession featured many individuals wearing military gear, PFLP paraphernalia, and PFLP banners. Mizar's body was also adorned in PFLP paraphernalia, as well as a PMRS orange reflective vest. For more details, see NGO Monitor's blog. Palestinian NGO medic killed in Bethlehem clashes had ties to PFLP terror groups. In October 2019, MAP Advocacy and Campaigns Manager Rohan Talbot spoke at a conference on standing up for Palestinian rights under increasing Israeli and US attacks. According to Talbot, governments must stop treating the Palestinian people as though they're the victims of some... Okay, never mind. You get the idea that this is a bit of a dishonest NGO, and it does have some very, very dodgy affiliations. I mean, it was based on what Nick Maynard said in that interview that I actually cancelled my own subscription to Medical Aid for Palestine. But okay, if you're working with, to try and improve the lot of the Palestinian people, you can't be too choosy about who you work with. But it seems there's external as well as internal reasons why it propagandizes for Hamas, or certainly propagandizes against Israel. I mean, this is the thing about NGOs. I think this is a bit harder for me to come to terms with. The UN kind of made sense. When it comes to NGOs, I mean, I've always assumed that people who get involved in charity work or medical work, I've always believed that they did it because they believed in a higher calling, and that they wanted to genuinely do good, and that they were motivated by honest aspirations, honest goals. But so it's hard to determine the why in this. Why would they be corrupt? Why would they lie? And I am at the point where I know that a lot of the modern left are rotten to the core, and that I would trust Israel's word over theirs. I know that Hamas are rotten to the core, obviously, and that I would trust Israel's word over theirs. I know that the UN are rotten to the core, and that I would trust Israel's word over theirs. When it comes to the NGO community, I'm not yet at the point where I see the UN NGO community as that rotten. It's still a bit of a stretch, a bit of a leap for me to believe that. But if you know what I mean, it's like, since this war broke out, I don't believe them quite as much as I did before. The thing is, wanting to believe over them, I know in my heart that wanting to believe Israel's account, wanting to believe the goodness of Israel over them, it's a kind of a wishful thinking. I want to believe that. It would be convenient and comfortable for me to believe that, rather than I'm sure, if you know what I mean. It's only bias that lends me to want to believe that, and against the weight of everything that's stacked against Israel in this existential fight it has on its hands. I want to believe that Israel is the noble good guys in this, or at least the nobler good guys in this, but I suppose in this instance with the kids shot in the head, there is that part of me that thinks this is almost so, it's almost a bit too far-fetched and evil to entirely believe, if you know what I mean. It's a bit of an outlandish story. It's a bit, but could it be true? I mean, the IDF is not perfect. But I think that's the thing. I fail to see why it would do this in this scenario. Given that if the IDF had the intention to just kill all the children in Gaza, then it would just carpet bomb the entire Gaza, surely. It wouldn't even bother with evacuation routes or anything like that, surely. So why would it kind of take the risks of a ground invasion to facilitate evacuations and take the terrorists out surgically if the soldiers were just going to kill everything that moves anyway? Of course, could there be some bad apples in the army? Possibly. But I think we need to take a deeper look. But the thing is, there has been, if this article did provoke a backlash and debunking responses, and I think it's probably worth looking at them. So first of all, I think it's worth looking at this. Here's one debunking article. Camera, Committee for Accuracy in the Middle East Reporting and Analysis. Alongside the war in Gaza, Hamas is also waging a propaganda campaign to demonize Israel and Jews in the international arena. That campaign aims to project Hamas's genocidal identity and image onto its intended victims, Israel and the Jewish people. The campaign is being executed with the engagement of bad actors and willing dupes from outside Gaza. The medical professionals' bad actors. Some of the most dangerous actors engaged in Hamas's cynical propaganda campaign come from the ranks of medical professionals who have entered the Gaza war zone to care for the injured and sick. No doubt some are motivated by humanitarian concerns and are disturbed by the medical emergencies, tragedies and devastation that they witness. They report on the injuries, deaths and difficulties in delivering medical care in a war zone, but do not go beyond that. At the same time, however, there are too many bad actors who are motivated by anti-Zionist animus. Beyond reporting on the medical situation in the hospitals they visited, these activists willingly participate in a mass propaganda war, spreading misinformation and falsehoods to demonize the Jewish state and foment hatred of its supporters. Take, for example, Mark Perlmutter, a physician who travelled to Gaza on a Palestinian-American Medical Association mission in April and who has since been actively engaged in Hamas's propaganda war. You might remember he was one of the listed doctors there. Upon his return to the US, Perlmutter teamed up with Feroze Sidwa, another participant in the mission whose anti-Israel activities long predate his becoming a physician. Perlmutter and Sidwa did not merely report about humanitarian suffering in Gaza, they launched a media campaign to defame the Jewish state with a salvo of accusations. Israel is guilty of genocide. Israel has committed crimes against humanity. Israel is responsible for the worst cruelty imaginable. The US is complicit in Israel's crimes. In fact, the only party they did not blame for the situation in Gaza is the party that is responsible for it, Hamas and its affiliated terrorist operatives. Okay. Perlmutter uses his Jewish connection, a Jewish father and surname to feign expertise on Judaism and endorse tropes that are generally associated with the most vicious anti-Semitic circles. For example, he equates Zionism, which is the head of Jewish self-determination, which is the idea. For example, he equates Zionism, which is the idea of Jewish self-determination, an integral part of Judaism, with Nazism, from his X account. Zionism is the sadism employed to ensure that there is no content other than the sadism. It is the moral equivalent of Nazism and definitely not Judaism. It is up to the Israelis to eliminate this political movement and outlaw Zionism, as Nazism is verboten in Germany. Honesty and truth are cast aside as he spews his extremist anti-Zionist bile. For example, to support his false claim that Israel deliberately targets innocent children as part of a genocide, Perlmutter minimises the number of Hamas combatants, leaders and operatives in Gaza to a preposterous degree, declaring those affiliated with Hamas account for only 0.01% of the Gazan population, i.e. around 200 people. If a rat is found inside of an Israeli orphanage, would Netanyahu burn down the entire orphanage and incinerate all the children within it merely to exterminate the single rat? Hamas is 0.01% of the Gaza, and the extermination of its population is a genocidal war crime. He falsely cast the war against Hamas as the deadliest conflict for medical workers and journalists that has ever been recorded in history. But even if we want to accept the propagandist casualty counts from pro-Hamas groups as face value, they are still far less than the numbers of medical professionals who were killed in other conflicts such as the Syrian Civil War or World War II, among others. No conflict of any size in history has ever been this deadly to journalists, healthcare workers or paramedics. Indeed, we and our entire team live in constant fear that Israel will attack this hospital directly, as it has with so many others. What is clear is that Perlmutter is unburdened by the obligation to be truthful, his primary goal being to disseminate anti-Israel propaganda. The MSN's willing dupes. Perlmutter would not be able to spread this animus against Israel and Perlmutter would not be able to spread his animus against Israel and Zionists without the willing dupes in the mainstream media who have abdicated their journalistic responsibility to vet pro-Hamas and anti-Zionist propagandists before offering them a platform as authorities on the war. These are the journalists and producers who offer Perlmutter and his ilk a platform to spread false propaganda about an Israeli genocide. Take, for example, the CBS producers who created an entire segment promoting Perlmutter's claims, or the producers of CNN International's Amanpour show who, a week and a half later, presented Perlmutter with another platform to increase his audience. Perlmutter's questionable allegations. The casualties in Gaza are almost exclusively children. The focus is on innocent children as well as healthcare workers and journalists who are specifically targeted. Even the UN's OCHA casualty count, which is dependent on Hamas's debated numbers, show that children accounted for less than a third of casualties. Israel engages the world's best snipers to target Palestinian toddlers as part of its genocidal war. Children were specifically targeted by high-velocity rifle bullet wounds. Perlmutter goes way beyond what's ascertainable from a medical standpoint. In the absence of any actual evidence, he presents himself as an expert, able to determine who the perpetrators are and what their motive is. According to him, the perpetrators are expert Israeli snipers whose motive is to murder Palestinian children and toddlers. When asked by a credulous Smith to verify that it is indeed snipers who are shooting children, Perlmutter assertively exclaimed definitively. As to his evidence, he declared, "I have children that were shot twice. I have 2 children that I have photographed of that were shot so perfectly in the chest I couldn't put my stethoscope over their heart more accurately. And directly on the side of the head in the same child. No toddler gets shot twice by mistake by the world's best sniper, and they are dead center shots." His CNN testimony repeats the same evidence, adding several additional embellishments. "We found children that had high-velocity bullet wounds, sniper bullet wounds, rifle wounds that were dead center in the chest. I mentioned to other reporters that I couldn't put my stethoscope more dead center over a heart than the entrance bullet hole was. There was no back to these children. The bullet had removed their entire torso. There was a similar bullet hole in 2 of the children's temples, so they were shot twice. One was certainly a kill shot. The second one was when they were on the ground, and so no sniper hits a child, and I'm talking toddlers twice by mistake." Beyond his muddled story, how many children and toddlers with 2 bullet holes were there? Perlmutter's testimony raises multiple questions regarding its veracity. 1. Perlmutter only saw the children in the hospital after their deaths. How is he able to ascertain the identity of the shooters, the circumstances of the shootings, and the victim's position when they were shot, based only on the size and location of the bullet holes in the body? 2. Why would a professional army engaged in active combat squander their top military assets, trained snipers and ammunition, to target children and toddlers instead of adult combatants? 3. Why would the world's best snipers capable of dead center shots require additional shots to confirm their victims' deaths? 4. If expert snipers aim so perfectly in dead center over the heart, why would they need to adjust their angle or squander extra bullets in targeting a separate part of the body? 5. If victims were found with shots to different areas of their body, wouldn't a far more likely scenario be that they were caught in crossfire in a combat zone? CBS reporter Tracy Smith not only readily accepted Perlmutter's accusations as truth, but tried to validate them by invoking other doctors in Gaza who also mentioned gunshot wounds to children, as if that was proof enough for the outrageous claim that expert snipers were deliberately targeting toddlers. That civilians in war zones, either adults or children, may sustain gunshot wounds does not indicate who shot them, Palestinian gunmen or Israeli soldiers, and certainly does not indicate deliberate targeting. To be fair, CNN's senior global affairs analyst Biana Golodriga, sitting in for Christiana Amanpour, was more circumspect in her interview, noting that it is quite an extreme allegation to make that these civilians were indeed targeted, and citing the IDF's refutation of the allegations that were made in the CBS News interview. However, this does not absolve CNN producers for having given Perlmutter a platform to air his outrageous claims. Now, okay, so his Twitter has a bias against Israel. That's not necessarily proof that he didn't see what he saw in Israel. In fact, it might indeed be that what he saw in Israel kind of confirms his bias. It's precisely incidents like this that inform his bias against Israel. Yeah, it makes sense, you'd think. And the incident he's described and the rhetoric he comes out with seem on the surface to go together. If he hates Israel that much, then why would he need to make up reasons to do so? It's like, it sounds like he has his own reason for hating Israel. Well, why would he need to make up reasons? If you know what I mean. What has kind of been exposed in this culture war in terms of the battles over wokeness is that when ideological capture happens of an institution, you'll be surprised what they are prepared to lie about and be dishonest about.
So, like, when it got to the end of the lecture, I just politely asked, because I was thinking this lecture is so imbalanced and it's so political, and why am I paying to kind of be taught politics when I'm here to do psychotherapy? I sort of said, I noticed that you've, related racism to Christianity on several occasions. I'm curious as to why you've sort of singled out that one religion, and I sort of thought that was quite a sort of, an okay question. I didn't accuse her. I was just curious. I was expressing curiosity. And she doubled down. She said, well, Christianity is responsible for racism because it's European. And I was just like, what the hell's going on? She did, and I said to her, I'm a Christian, and she didn't apologize. She didn't seem kind of open to debate. And what I noticed, because this was on a Zoom call when it was during COVID, so we were doing everything online. And I noticed that all the sort of people on the Zoom call were sort of like in agreement with her, and they were like outraged that I'd even asked a question.
How could you see that? Was it like
on the looks? It's like all the looks sort of totally changed. Like, what is this? And
furrowed brows.
Yeah. And even the sort of the other supervisors and the course lead who was on the Zoom call, it was suddenly like, what am I doing? Why is she asking this? And I was like, well, hang on a minute, we've just sat through like a kind of piece of propaganda for like over half an hour. It was all stuff about how the media was racist to Meghan Markle, how this so-and-so person was racist. And I was like, what has this got to do with psychology and psychotherapy? There's no evidence here. So that happened, and I suddenly felt like, okay, what's going on here? Because, the way they reacted wasn't normal, because I sort of thought, I had to sort of doubt, I sort of thought, hang on, what did I just say? Was it okay? And I thought, no, it was okay. It was just a question. So that happened. And then not long after that, there was a lecture that was sent round to all the students. It was celebrating the sort of 100th anniversary of the Tavistock. And it was called Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time.
Oh, don't.
And it was an hour of critical race theory. Totally, it was unbelievable. There was no kind of other side to the debate. So that the lecturer, Helen Morgan, was saying things like, white people are responsible for all the problems in the world.
She said that?
Yeah, she was saying white people. She was saying white privilege like it was a fact. She was saying things like, all white people are racist, essentially. Even white children are racist. And we need to be aware of children's race.
Children's racism.
And it wasn't what I was concerned with. I'm quite an open-minded person, right? So if somebody has a different politics to me, I've worked with lots of patients that disagree with me on all sorts of things. I'm open to that. But I guess what really worried me is that it wasn't saying there is this thing called critical race theory. It's a theory. This is what it says. And you can agree with it on this line, or you can disagree with it. And here's people's opposition to it. It was presenting it as a fact. And actually, it became more and more hysterical as it went on. So towards the end of the lecture, when there was Q&As, like people were like becoming tearful about the fact that they'd taken the colourblind approach and how awful that was to, that they needed to be aware that there are differences. And I was like, I sort of had this moment where I thought, oh my God, that the lunatics are in charge of the asylum. Yeah. Like I just thought, if you get one bad egg, you sort of think, okay, I get it. This person's a bit dodgy. But it was like everyone on this Zoom call, nobody was questioning it. Nobody was sort of saying, oh, are there any downsides to this theory? Or, is there any, what's your evidence for that? It was just, ideology, dogma all the way through. And I said, well, look, I think racism's a really important thing to think about. I said, my view of not being racist is not judging a person by the colour of their skin, not being prejudiced, treating everyone equally. I said, I take the sort of what's known as the colourblind approach. And she said, essentially here at the Tavistock, that we see that now as discredited. And I was like, whoa. And I said, this lecture, Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time, is that just the view of this lecturer, or is that the view of the whole trust? And she said, that would be the trust's view. And I was, at that point, I was like, where do I go from here? This is crazy. So, as I said, I wrote a complaint, and initially they took the complaint quite seriously, and they were like, we're going to look into it. So I was thinking that's really good. And they did this long investigation. They met with me, and I explained, my view of. I said that I take the colourblind approach, and why I just quoted this lecturer and said this is racist because it's a generalisation about a race. And they met with the person who said it, and so on. And at the end of this investigation, I got a letter, an investigation report sent to me, and it basically said that I was the problem, that they encourage all their students to interrogate whiteness, and that I need to find a safe space in which to interrogate whiteness. And the fact that I was showing opposition to these ideas showed that there was kind of a lack of my ability to learn. So there's something wrong in my learning.
Oh, very 1984, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to learn and be re-educated.
You have to
Did you
learn.
feel in these moments, because we all know that feeling just if you're arguing with a friend, right?
Yeah.
Someone says something that you're like, what? And that's a horrible feeling, like, gosh, oh no, I didn't mean... did you feel like the world was like closing, falling in on you?
It was so strange because, like I said, I was only saying that there are different opinions, and we might work with people that don't agree with this. And I personally don't agree with it, but in the NHS, we will see patients that don't agree with this. And I explained why I thought it was wrong. And I sort of thought, well, how can they disagree with that? Because I'm pretty being open-minded. Like, I don't mind if the lecturer that teaches me is, in their spare time, a critical race theorist or communist or whatever. They can believe what they believe, but I'm just saying we need to have an openness. And the fact that so quickly it became, like you said, the walls started closing in on me so quickly. I was like, whoa.
Was there panic when you sort of read these emails?
Yeah, I was panicking a little bit, but I was thinking, hang on, I've kind of got the law on my side here a little bit, because it seems to me like they're breaching the Equality Act. I wasn't even sure at that point. And I was thinking, look, I surely haven't said anything wrong. There's nothing that they could pull out that would be wrong. So I was just kind of curious to see, I thought that maybe these few lecturers I'd encountered had sort of gone rogue a bit. And I was expecting the institution to be like, no, of course you can have a different opinion, and I thought that would be it. And I thought it's so important to speak out so that people know. But that was not the case. It was very quickly, I was in the wrong. And and it kept happening. So they kept sending reading material through to us it was the writings of Robin DiAngelo.
Yeah, gosh.
Yeah,
who I think has become... It's so hard to know whether people like you and I, people like you and me, and people who are listening to the podcast have, over the years, moved further and further into a space that is not real life. I don't know. Have we been audience captured, or has it become more and more evident across the population that Robin DiAngelo is just an utter fraud, and that all of these things are utterly ridiculous? And I don't know. Do you know?
It is strange because, I mean, she's just had a cameo in the recent Matt Walsh film where she's totally kind of embarrassed and shown up to be what she is. I think there's more and more people who are sort of seeing that she's a fraud, but then at the same time, it seems like anti-white racism or critical race theory is getting worse because it's becoming more prevalent in schools. Like the Labour Party are pushing it more and more. So you see it kind of, both sides are getting stronger, but they're equally opposed. So yeah, I mean, at the Tavistock, it was as though Robin DiAngelo's ideas were gospel. It was like, she's the authority on race. And I was like, well, she's not a clinical psychologist. Her ideas aren't evidence-based. Why are we going to this person? It was almost had a religious feel to it. So they kept sending her reading material through, and it was saying like overtly racist things. And I just thought, okay, I just ignore it. I won't say anything. And then we had like a review of the term seminar where I was asked by the lead of the course if there'd been anything that had annoyed me on the course or anything I disliked. And I said, well, actually, yeah, this recent reading material from Robin DiAngelo, I've already flagged up that there's racism on this course, and you're sending me through her work again, and I don't agree with it, and I don't think we should be going to this person for ideas on race. And I just explained that, again, as I said to you, that it wasn't evidence-based and so on. And I was told to stop speaking, and I did. And then the day after that, I got an email through from the course lead saying that they were raising a student conduct policy against me, which is the first stages of like removing someone from the course. Wow.
So that must have hurt, because this is your life.
Yeah, I was terrified. So I'd been, like, I come from quite a working class background. I'd been working as a nurse for a long time, saving up to do this training, like to be a psychotherapist. I'd done really well in my first 2 years. My work with patients was going well. And I was just thinking, oh my God, how could somebody do this to me? In the body of the email, she wrote to me, she said that I lacked maturity, that I'd been vexatious in the way I spoke to her, that was inappropriate, and that I'd created a traumatizing environment for the other students. So
you've traumatized them.
Yeah.
They're traumatized now.
But because I disagreed, like, with the...
Oh, man.
When ideological capture happens, you'll be surprised what people in the institution are prepared to lie about. And if there is a Hamas overtone or ethos to a lot of these NGOs, then that can be one reason that they would lie to the extreme. And that, the fact that they're ideologues is what determines their hatred before anything else. Before any facts on the ground justify it, and they will twist the facts on the ground to justify their ideology or their mission statement. Now, the reaction it got on Twitter was quite significant. Ethan Fishberger said, "Alright, so for those of you keeping score, here's where we stand on the NY Times op-ed accusing the IDF of intentionally shooting Gazan kids in the head. 1. The author of the piece is an anti-Israel fanatic who wrote for Electronic Intifada, and whitewashes Hamas's crimes. 2. The organisation that sent the medical professionals to Gaza hosts Linda Sarsour for events and posts overt Hamas disinformation." Oh, okay. Well, we all know about that cockroach, don't we? Multiple forensic ballistic specialists have concluded that the images provided in the NYT pieces evidence are either digitally altered or outright fabricated, corroborated by medical professionals. New York Times guest essay shredded online after claiming IDF targets Gazan children. The New York Times opinion essay, 65 doctors, nurses and paramedics, what we saw in Gaza from October 9th, blew up over the weekend as weapons of forensic ballistic experts debunked and questioned X-ray images. The New York Times opinion essay, 65 doctors, nurses and paramedics, what we saw in Gaza from October 9, blew up over the weekend as weapons and forensic ballistic experts debunked and questioned X-ray images featured in the piece claiming to be 5.56 caliber bullets inside the skulls of Gazan children. The actual impact of a 5.56 caliber bullet was nowhere close to what these images claimed to be, but this thread on X, formerly Twitter, gathers various inputs across the platform. With no exit wounds present, skull fractures or change in the shape of the bullets, the authenticity of these X-rays was concluded as being highly problematic. Emily Schrader says, "The New York Times appears to have published completely false fake news in order to falsely accuse the IDF of committing war crimes and shooting children at point-blank range, which Gazan and foreign medics testify they witnessed. The only problem with this is the evidence provided by those same experts appears, according to analysis from numerous ballistics experts, radiologists, trauma nurses, medics and more, to be digitally altered or completely falsified. The NYT needs to answer for this. This is completely irresponsible and incitement to violence at a time when Jews are being actively attacked globally, fueled by disinformation like this. Here's the NYT article. There are the X-rays that purport to show children who were treated after being shot by the IDF with what they claim is a 5.56 caliber bullets, yet there are no skull fractures, no exit wounds, and no change in the bullet itself from a rifle. Come on. As people far more knowledgeable than me would say, there's no way these X-rays show what the experts in Gaza claim they show. which of course makes their entire testimony highly suspect. This suggests in short that the NY Times did not verify the information in the piece adequately before it was published, thereby allowing lies to be platformed to the public. Here are two extensive examinations of the X-ray images. Mark Tardio says, as a former law enforcement officer, retired Special Forces soldier, Green Beret and sniper, I feel confident in saying I know the effects of 5.56 NATO. Conclusion. The NYT lied or failed to verify the information presented to them. This is based on the MV and BC of the M855 ball ammo currently being used by the IDF. Dr. Mimi stated she worked in Khan Yunis from August 8th to September the 5th. The IDF announced on August the 9th, 2024, they were beginning another ground operation in Khan Yunis. Major combat operations by the IDF were completed on August the 30th. This means Dr. Mimi was on the ground in Khan Yunis for the entire operation, according to her claim. Dr. Mimi Syed provided these pictures to the NYT and stated, I had multiple paediatric patients, mostly under the age of 12, who were shot in the head or the left side of the chest. Usually these were single shots. The patients came in either dead or critical and died shortly after arriving. There are two issues with her accusations provided in the photos and statements. 1. Accuracy. 2. Velocity and penetration. Ballistics of the M855 fired from an A14-inch barrel. Muzzle velocity... Okay, but anyway. Even at sea level with high humidity, the M855 fired from an M4 will remain supersonic beyond 500 meters. The M855 green tip ammo is designed to penetrate body armor and defeat barricades and cover. However, this comes at a cost in accuracy. An M4 shooting the M855 round does an average accuracy of around 4 minutes of angle. That is roughly a 4-inch shot group at 100 yards. At 200 yards, the shot group expands to 8 inches. At 300 yards, it increases to 12 inches. The average diameter of the adult male head is about 8 inches. The size of a child's head will vary based on age. Hitting a 4-inch to 8-inch target at greater than 100 meters with an M4 is a challenge on the range with stationary targets. In combat conditions with moving targets, it would be almost impossible. The M855 travels too fast at that range and is designed to penetrate. It would easily, without question, press completely through a child's skull at those ranges. This leads to the next question. Were the X-ray images the result of ricochets? Well, no. When projectiles travelling that fast strike another object, they tend to deform and tumble. We would see that represented in the X-rays. We do not. Further, over 190,000 IDPs fled Khan Yunis prior to the start of their combat operations on August the 9th. History of Khan Yunis. According to Doctors Without Borders, on July 22nd and 27, the Israeli forces issued 2 evacuation orders in Khan Yunis. According to OCHA, from July 22nd to 25th, approximately 190,000 Palestinians were displaced in Khan Yunis and Deir al-Bala. In 2017, Khan Yunis population was above 205,000. It is more than fair to say the vast majority of the population left following the warnings from the IDF. Khan Yunis is Gaza's second largest city and where the Nasser hospital is located, likely where she worked. Following an IDF withdrawal from Khan Yunis in April 2024, Nasser hospital staff claimed the IDF had murdered Palestinians and buried them in mass graves outside their hospitals. This false claim was easily debunked. Even the NYT reported that 2 mass graves were on the grounds of the hospital prior to the operation. Other articles can be found as early as January 2024, quoting the hospital manager claiming hospital staff buried hundreds of deceased patients on the grounds of the hospital. And in more depth, the forensic medical evidence is provided here. Cheryl wrote it. Okay. Hello, Ahmed. I saw your post after seeing the reply from Colonel Richard Kemp and Ant Speaks, and then I read the article twice. As someone who is actually a forensic ballistic specialist, I wanted to respond to your post in this article with some facts that will demonstrate just how deliberately dishonest and inaccurate both your post and the article are. 1. The damage to the body by bullet shot depends on the weapon and caliber used. A small low-caliber pistol will always have less damage than a high-caliber rifle such as the 5.56 you in the article mention. 2. The most important factor that determines the level of damage is velocity. and a 5.56 caliber high velocity rifle as is used by the IDF will therefore have a high degree of damage to the head and skull. None of the most obvious types of damage from any gunshot wound to the head, nevertheless, a 5.56 high velocity rifle shot are visible. 3. When the bullet hits the skull at high velocity, it bevels into the skull, which means as it's passing through the skull, the immediate entry is small and clean, whereas the exit at the front of the skull inside the head is wider and flared. It splinters the skull bone on entry, creates bone shards that then move with the bullet and cause even more damage. 4. Once the bullet enters the head, especially at high velocity, it heats up and creates a shockwave in front of the bullet, which widens as the bullet travels through the head, causing more damage. The brain is a solid, soft, and highly inelastic organ, which means the damage to the brain is such that it literally mushes. The shockwave on entry causes external gases to enter the head in front of the bullet, and thus significant displacement of brain matter very rapidly, which in turn causes the head to expand rapidly, thus causing primary and secondary fractures in various areas of the skull. None such fractures are visible in these x-rays. 5. Back to the velocity of the 5.56 rifle shot. For any bullet to stop in the area shown in any of the x-ray images, the bullets would need to travel at a very low velocity. That means either the bullets were fired by low velocity small caliber pistols, or the rifle shots would need to have been fired from a very long distance, many hundreds of meters, with pinpoint accuracy. When looking at the images, the caliber of bullets are not the same. The first image has a much shorter bullet than the second, meaning it could not be the same caliber. Now, if the children were deliberately shot in the head and neck, it would mean it would be from close range. With a high velocity 5.56 rifle of the type the IDF used, the bullet would never stop so quickly, ever. The bullet would travel so quickly due to velocity they would almost always exit the skull or body, causing much larger exit wounds. None are visible as the bullets are all magically stopped for the perfect X-ray pose. As you can see, there is no damage to the brain in the x-rays. This is even more true than neck shots where the bullets barely travel an inch and stop at the spine. This would happen only with very low velocity small caliber handguns such as 2.2 caliber pistols. 6. Basically, for any of the x-rays to be true, there would need to be low velocity pistols and not high velocity rifles. The distance of fire would still not be very close range as the damage is not significant enough. Very close range has high velocity, thus more damage. I'm quite happy for any other ballistics experts to come and debate the post and article and my analysis above. What I can pretty comfortably say is that these are not head and neck shots by high velocity 5.56 rifles. At best, these may be wounds from ricochets, which would mean they are not deliberate and completely accidental, and also not from close range, but would account for the much lower velocity. At worst, and more likely, this entire post of yours in the article is complete and utter bullshit. Thanks for reading, Cheryl. As Honest Reporting previously stated in its critique of the piece on Friday, these testimonies are not proof that these casualties are a result of IDF fire. Indeed, Hamas is also known to shoot their own people. As Richard Kemp says, nothing here is proof of war crimes by the IDF. This X-ray, which looks suspicious anyway, certainly doesn't prove it. Who is to say the headshots were not Hamas fire, either deliberately or unintentionally aimed at their own children? Hamas do use 5.56 as well as other calibers, and they do murder their own people. If Israeli, who is to say whether they were crossfire, ricochet, or otherwise not deliberately targeted, and therefore not necessarily war crimes? Children can and have carried out terrorist acts for Hamas and therefore can be legitimate targets, no matter how tragic that is, including for the soldiers who are forced to deal with them. Just a note on that. Paul Mason has said that children can be runners for Hamas. They can kind of be informants. They can look at a soldier approaching on the street, rush to tell Hamas fighters to line up their ambush, and the ambush usually comes from, because the Hamas will kind of go through the tunnel network and can actually emerge out of the tunnel network at various points in various buildings, so that an IDF soldier will be dealing with a Hamas sniper who is able to move from one building to another, just the one sniper. And moreover, the Hamas sniper will be able to not just move from building to building, but to pick up extra arms in each building, because there's a reserve of weapons usually in the children's bedroom of a house. So they can actually travel light, without carrying heavy arms, and just the arms are provided for them to do it. And they're able to do ambushes like that. They're prepared for that. It's kind of ingenious, like, it's kind of ingenious, really, in a way. So it's horrible, but maybe there are situations in which IDF has to take a chance, just has to assume that anyone who's not been evacuated is a potential informant or runner for Hamas. Reconnaissance runner for Hamas, if you know what I mean. They're to do Hamas's reconnaissance for them.
The idea that what Israel's doing in Gaza is a genocide is nothing but an obscenity, and how Professor Finkelstein can utter those words is beyond me. But the reality is that Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. It doesn't exist in its own right. It was created by Iran, it's funded by Iran, it's armed by Iran, it's directed by Iran. And it exists as part of a ring of steel of Iranian proxies around Israel with the intention to destroy Israel. This has nothing to do with protecting anybody. It's all about trying to annihilate Israel, which is one of Iran's agendas.
Why is it that yesterday 45 doctors who served in Gaza this past year, 45 doctors, published a letter in which they said that every day in the hospitals, they had to deal with children who were shot in the head or in the chest. It wasn't shrapnel. It wasn't indiscriminate bombing. It was children who were targeted in the head and the chest. Why is that, Mr. Kemp, Israel's favorite cheerleader with his pom-poms?
Okay.
Why is it, Mr. Kemp?
I'd like to.
Why is it, Mr. Kemp?
I think we should let Colonel Kemp respond now.
Allow me just to finish. Why is it, Mr. Kemp?
Don't start talking. I want to come. Let Colonel Kemp respond. There's a lot of allegations against him.
Allow me to finish.
Not allowed in.
Allow me to finish.
Okay.
Why is it, Mr. Kemp, that Israeli snipers shot at 2 women in a church convent when all the details of their presence had been sent to Israeli military officials? Why did Israel fire 2 tank shells in the convent complex at a building housing 54 children with disabilities? Does that sound to you like a war,
okay, well,
Mr. Kemp?
Or
does it sound to you like a genocide?
Norman, I want to let Colonel Kemp respond. You made a number of allegations against him. Colonel Kemp, your chance to respond.
Can I add?
Rama, I want Colonel Kemp to be able to respond. So let him respond. Colonel Kemp.
I wouldn't accuse Professor Finkelstein of lying as he accused me of lying, but he's obviously badly mistaken about the decision or the pronouncement of the International Court of Justice, who did not say, no justice on that court said that Israel's plausibly committing a genocide. And that's been clarified by the former president of the ICJ,
and that's
who
a
said
flat-out lie.
And it was said that you want to control the airwaves now, Mr. Finkelstein, do you? It was said that that South Africa had a plausible case, was in a plausible position to bring a Case of genocide, not that there was a plausible genocide.
That's a flat-out lie.
Dismissed by the International Court of Justice. And the second thing is, all the examples that Mr. Finkelstein gave, he reeled off just now, I can't answer every single one of those allegations, but let's assume they all did happen, as he said. Let's assume that. I don't believe they did, but let's assume it. None of that is genocide. What is genocide?
There's video footage.
Is Hamas's
There's
policy.
IDF soldiers on TikTok showcasing their war crimes audaciously.
Charter describes its mission as being genocide against both the Israelis and the Jewish people as a whole. Their actions on the 7th of October confirmed their intent to commit genocide. The words of their leaders repeatedly wanting to do more and more 7th of Octobers reaffirms that policy. It is Hamas that is a genocidal terrorist organization. Israel is a Western liberal democracy defending its own people according to international law.
But it's the response of the article's author, Dr. Feroz Sidwa, that really puts a nail in the coffin of this piece's legitimacy. The author of the NYT piece weighs in, and it's exactly what you'd expect. Hi Emily. Unfortunately, those things that you think are known are not true. While Israel has killed hundreds of people in several flower massacres, I'm quite unaware of Hamas shooting anyone trying to access aid. Hamas certainly does shoot and torture dissidents, while Israel shoots and tortures Palestinians on a truly industrial scale. As far as Hamas maximising civilian deaths as a strategy, that is absolutely false. This is an asked and answered question. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch both addressed it explicitly in their reports on Operation Casey Lade. As did the... surely it means Cast-Led. As did the UN fact-finding mission headed by lifelong lover of Israel, Richard Goldstone, as did the American National Lawyers Guild. Everyone who seriously investigates the question finds that Hamas does not utilise human shields. By contrast, Israel has a long and heavy photographically documented history of using not only Palestinians but young children as human shields. To deny that Hamas uses civilians as human shields and claim Israel does, as well as denying that maximising civilian deaths is in Hamas's interests, is not only delusional, it is an intentional, blatant lie. There are countries, journalists and international bodies, the UN included, which have confirmed the use of human shields. Hamas leaders like Yahya Sinwar have even been outspoken on the role innocent civilians play in their strategy to defeat Israel. PAMA's roots. But more than that, the organisation that sent these doctors into Gaza as volunteers, the Palestinian American Medical Association, has a history entangled with the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, a US organisation that has been tied to terrorist groups. I will question the motives of any organisation that routinely collaborates with CAIR, the US-based Hamas front group, and hosts anti-Semite extraordinaire Linda Sarsour. It appears that PAMA is no stranger to outright disinformation, and the proof is in the pudding for this NY Times piece as well. Proof the piece was authored by a PAMA volunteer, as was the person who supplied the images, Dr. Mimi Sayed. It's a shame because I'm sure PAMA has done important work in Gaza with those tragically impacted by the war, but there's no excuse for joining the disinformation campaign. Lesson for the New York Times: consider your sources, and no mission that seems righteous should come at the expense of your publication's integrity. Just because a claim fits your ideological worldview in Israel, it doesn't remove the obligation to fact-check and do journalistic due diligence. Okay, so the waters are kind of muddied there. And like I said, I think there was the belief that the claim was a bit too outlandish to believe. Like, it almost seemed to be kind of like supremely evil behaviour by the IDF that just seemed a bit too far-fetched. But at the same time, there was a part of me that thought it was a bit too far-fetched that someone would lie about it either, if it had happened. I mean, it's different with Hamas, because Hamas are very demonstrative in the atrocities they commit and in the rhetoric they use. So when they committed the unspeakable evils on October the 7th, it was very believable. It was very in character for them. I mean, I think what inclines me to be sceptical is actually looking at Mark Perlmutter's Twitter account. And I have to say, like, I've seen, pictures of him working in other hospitals around the world, doing international work, presenting as, someone who was, genuinely believes in the Doctors Without Borders mission statement and ethos. But when it comes to Hamas, I have noticed, when it comes to this particular war, I have noticed him sometimes gate crashing other accounts and posting pictures of the horrific images from the hospital he's shown. Now the thing is, usually it's the same 4 clips of children with shrapnel marks, children who've just come out of having been buried in rubble, who are just barely clinging on to life. He's not shy about showing graphic images on Twitter, frankly. And, in fact, in shoving it in everyone's face. But the question is, if this is what he's seen, if he's actually seen children sniped in the head, then I don't see him sharing any of those pictures, even though you would think this is the most graphic, irrefutable case of all. And if he's prepared to do it with other victims, then why not that? Why not, really press home the case? Which suggests that he has fabricated it. He's made it up. That's what I think. I'll easily believe that, journalists like Max Blumenthal are kind of lying creeps, because I've seen them on Twitter. They give off a very slimy, narcissistic air of just being in it for clicks and their cult of personality, and they're prepared to spew any lie, spin any conspiracy theory, just to justify their malevolent narrative. They're just kind of narcissistic like that. They're just very nasty narcissists. I know what they're about, and I know why they're about it, if you know what I mean. Same with the UN. I'm now at a position where I know what the UN is all about. It's just a criminal racket of vindictive dictatorships who, of course, have it in for Israel. Now, when it comes to the NGO community versus Israel, I'm not yet at that point where I where I just instantly disbelieve the NGO community, but I'm getting there. The more I look into NGO Monitor, and it lists various different NGOs working in Gaza and the West Bank, and how there's been kind of cross affiliations with groups like Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, legitimate terror groups, and that they do have a record of lying and downplaying the presence of Hamas in Gaza. The more I sense, okay, I don't believe them like I used to. It's not quite I completely disbelieve them. It's like, when it comes to Max Blumenthal, Owen Jones, or the UN, I am at a point where I would not believe anything they said on Israel. I would not believe them if they said that rain was wet. I would not believe them if they claimed that rain was wet, frankly. That's how much I distrust them. When it comes to these kind of NGO doctors, I'm not quite there yet. But I'm getting there, if you know what I mean. And I think what has to be illustrated is that, very briefly, it sounds like these NGOs are kind of ideologically captured. By by the left worldview that's very, very anti-Zionist, very anti-Israel, very anti-Zionist. And when institutions get ideologically captured, as we've seen in the West, when institutions have been ideologically captured by the woke, by BLM, by critical race theory, when they get that ideologically captured, you would be amazed what they are prepared, what people in it are prepared to lie about, and how far they're willing to go to demonize their opponents.
What do you make of, I think it was a New York Times article about lots of babies being shot in the head? Did you see that?
That's been thoroughly debunked. I mean, those photographs have been shown to be fake, apart from anything else. If you are shooting anyone in the head at that range, you don't get an X-ray of an intact skull with a bullet embedded in it.
Now, worst case scenario, for all the defences put there, I mean, because I believe the NYT the New York Times did respond and say, okay, the X-ray images were faked, but they were faked, to be faked for a good reason, because the images we were shown were far too graphic to show. They actually did show severe brain damage, so a faked up version of the image was a better way to illustrate it without undignifying the dead. Is that possible? I guess. Now, okay, so that's kind of why I'm a bit instinctively suspicious But at the same time, I wondered, well, why? Where do I stand if this is true? Because, on the other side, you got an absolutely rotten, demonic, anti-Semitic left who are relishing the prospect of the end of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. And you've got Hamas, who are still propagating the war. And who clearly don't care about their people enough to surrender. And, the worst case scenario is that at least one of these accounts by these doctors is true. But it seems less and less plausible as I go through it. Unless there is just some complete bastard in the at least there really is some complete bastard in the IDF who is, I suppose, taking out the revenge on the Palestinian kids. I mean, the doctors who work for Hamas, there's a bit of a I never quite understood that. I mean, I do wonder if they're loyal to Hamas as doctors. Because I do wonder how this works, this idea of martyrdom. If you're a doctor who works in a Hamas-run hospital, and it's like, then what is your job as a doctor? Do you uphold the Hippocratic Oath to save lives, or is your job to serve Hamas's goal of actually ensuring more martyrs that will discredit Israel? I don't think that's true either, or at least that's what my gut would tell me. It would tell me that the doctors have to fulfill something of a medical role. They have to do what doctors do. I mean, it's what they've trained for. But if they care about the children killed, wouldn't they denounce Hamas for propagating this war? But it seems that they're, like I said, they're ideologically committed to this, to the Hamas cause.
When it comes to the NGOs, well, I've previously engaged with quite senior individuals at Human Rights Watch and put to them that the founder of that organization lamented how it has become viciously anti-Israel, how it has an obsessional bias against the Jewish state. He was himself Jewish, but he had subsequently distanced himself. The very founder of the organization had distanced himself from it because it has so very badly lost its way.
I mean, do I believe they're lying? I don't know. I'd like to believe they're lying. And the more I read that article, the more I'm persuaded they're probably lying. I'm more convinced than not, but that's a luxury belief, if you know what I mean. Like I said, I'm not yet at the point where I instinctively disbelieve NGOs in excess. The NGO community, it hasn't yet been tainted by the same rot as the UN has for me, and certainly not the Hamas has, or the extremists on the left. But I'm possibly getting there, if you know what I mean. Now I think the reason I'm saying all this is, the reason I've had to cite all this is, unfortunately, like I said, the weakness of Mosab sometimes is that he's very evangelical and very zealous in his allegiance to Israel, which sometimes means he just will simply not entertain charges like this rather than give them the answer that they truly deserve. So he'll just gloss over it and fall hardline on his ideological convictions. I mean, Mosab is in some ways an ideologue. He is, but it's informed by experience, and it's he's from having seen things from both sides, from the other side, and his chief fury is at Hamas. That's what animates him, and that's a strength in some ways. It means that he can cut through the propaganda bullshit and actually get to the core of Hamas are the evil here.
If the Israeli protocol is not sufficient and it's not satisfactory to the expectations of Abby and many of her friends, then I say, how about we punish Hamas by their own laws, by the Islamic law? Why don't we follow the Islamic protocol? In this case, the Islamic law says, behead all men and take all women and children as booty. This is their moral stand.
The bottom line is, I'm not yet at the point where I'm completely disillusioned in the NGO community. Because it doesn't entirely make sense in the way that the UN does and Hamas does. And even the international doctors and nurses, I still tend to think of them as people who are following a higher calling to live by the Hippocratic Oath. I mean, the opportunity is there now that South Africa has gotten involved in presenting a case against Israel that will force it to end its military operations. There is, in some kind of distorted altruistic sense, a motivation for them to make up things that will add to the perception of Israel as a state committing war crimes and therefore must be stopped. If they've worked, if they're dealing with Gaza civilians, then they're incentivized. I suppose in that sense they're incentivized to lie, to force Israel to stop, because nothing else is stopping Israel's war effort. It can be, the motivation can be that basic, and in some ways, in some strange way, based on some degree of good intentions, but in terms of, they think if the bombing stops, then the war stops, the bombing stops, the civilian collateral stops. It's like, if you are in that industry, what is the path of least resistance? And when South Africa has given you a golden egg, as it were, of, we are now building up a case, a dishonest case against Israel that could be effective and could end, international support for Israel, Western support for Israel. They're going to go for it. So maybe that's why they're lying. Suddenly it seems more plausible that they could lie. But we don't know the whole story. I mean, the sad thing is, a lot of people are very sceptical. I mean, a lot of people on the right are very cynical about NGOs and disparaging about NGOs as, being kind of, sainted organisations that, often do have corruption scandals. The problem, of course, is, corruption can mean everything and nothing. I mean, Trump is on corruption charges that turned out to be, the mildest shit imaginable. And this was their best effort to defame him, and all they could find was, really kind of weak source examples of corruption. But all the same, the right wing tend to say the NGOs are often corrupt. They feign this charitable mission, and usually there's exposed all kinds of hypocrisies, and that's usually on the basis of defaming their saintly, sanctimonious image and saying, why should they lecture us about the way we should live our life? Why should they be allowed to turn Britain or the West into one big refugee camp? Or make us feel guilty if we don't turn the country into one big refugee camp? And also there's the disparaging point of, well, look, it's in the name NGOs, non-government organisations. Generally, that's interpreted as non-accountability. And so, there's that, I suppose. But no one's ever really gone into the details of how corrupt NGOs can be. But you also have to factor in that UNRWA has existed since the 1940s. So, if agencies can become corrupt, like 75 years is a long time for corruption to seep in and for an institutionalized view to kind of coagulate, an ideological view to coagulate.
I'm Yisrael Chai. I'm Yisrael Chai. And Amnesty International, go to hell. Shame on you. Jewish women, girls, mothers, brutalized, raped, parts of their bodies cut off. And you are absolutely silent, you hypocrites.
One more thing I'm going to read before I press on is this. Here's a passage from the book Israelophobia by Jake Wallis Simons. In 2022, 11 Days in May, a film about the previous year's Gaza conflict was released. Narrated by Kate Winslet, it examined the deaths of 60 Palestinian young people in a highly emotive manner, while turning a blind eye to the threat to Israel. Before long, people began noticing inaccuracies. In the script, Winslet suggested that Israel had loaded up its fighter jets with bombs and missiles after plastic bottles were thrown at security forces in Jerusalem, and just 7 rockets were launched from Gaza. In truth, Israel had taken military action against Hamas targets after 76 rockets had been launched indiscriminately at its civilian populations. The documentary made no mention of the 4,360 rockets fired at Israel during the ensuing conflict, or the 13 Israelis who had lost their lives. Moreover, 7 of the dead Palestinian youngsters featured in the film had actually perished when Hamas's own rockets mistakenly hit Gaza, while several others were underage combatants killed while mounting attacks alongside adult militants. The whole thing began to resemble a stitch-up. How could this have happened? There were clues. The distinguished British director Michael Winterbottom had not travelled to the region for the making of the film. Instead, he had relied on Mohammed Sawaf, a Gazan, for on-the-ground material. Here the plot thickened. On social media, Sawaf, who was billed as co-director, had celebrated the launching of rockets at civilian targets and stated that the map of Palestine should extend from the sea to the river. Code for the dismantlement of Israel. More damningly, it turned out that Hamas had granted him an award for countering the Zionist narrative. Was there any wonder the film was not entirely impartial? Which brings us to another question. How did Winslet, and Winterbottom for that matter, become weaponised by this apparent propaganda project? When the controversy erupted, the actress pleaded ignorance. That my participation could be interpreted as taking a stand on the rights and wrongs of one of the world's most tragic and intractable conflicts never entered my thinking, she said. War is a tragedy for all sides. Children have no voice in the conflict. I simply wanted to lend them mine. There is no reason to doubt the actress's intentions or indeed her naivety. Presumably the one-sided film didn't sound any alarm bells in her head, even as she narrated its obvious untruths in a recording studio. It didn't presumably feel wrong to her. Indeed, it seems likely that it felt right. Winslet is far from the only progressive to have been unwittingly weaponised by the Hamas agenda. At the height of the same conflict in 2021, the New York Times, American left-wing paper of record, published a searing front page mourning 64 young Palestinian victims. It had denied this treatment to the many civilian casualties of the vicious Turkish assault on the Kurds. It had denied this treatment to the many civilian casualties of the vicious Turkish assault on the Kurds or the Royal Air Force's major air offensive in Iraq, both of which occurred at around the same time. Under a headline reminding us that they were just children, the page was dominated by a poignant grid of young faces. In the article, the Grey Lady, as the venerable paper is known, informed readers that they had wanted to be doctors, artists and leaders. Yet, once again, inaccuracies had crept in. It soon emerged that, as was the case with the Winslet film, at least 10 of the New York Times casualties had been killed by Hamas's own rockets falling short in Gaza, while at least 2 had been participating in attacks. As if this wasn't enough, the paper had even included a photograph from 6 years before of an unidentified girl wrapped in a keffiyeh which it wrongly presented as one of the dead. Seemingly, their enthrallment to the Israelophobic narrative caused the US's most respected editors to take leave of their basic journalistic standards. There have been many other instances of this. One landmark came in 2002. After 30 Jewish civilians were murdered in a suicide attack on a Netanya hotel during Passover, Israeli forces targeted terrorists in the West Bank city of Jenin, and a bloody battle ensued. The British press overflowed with outrage. A monstrous war crime that Israel has tried to cover up for a fortnight has finally been exposed, howled The Independent. Its correspondent, Phil Reeves, based his report on the testimony of a lone eyewitness, Kamal Anis, who reported seeing Israeli soldiers pile 30 bodies beneath a half-wrecked house. When the pile was complete, they bulldozed the building, bringing its ruins down on the corpses. Then they flattened the area with a tank. The Daily Telegraph ran the same story. The Guardian published an emotive leading article comparing the operation in Jenin, which had left 53 Palestinians and 23 Israelis dead, to the 9/11 atrocities, which had killed almost 3,000. The correspondent for the Times of London, Janine Di Giovanni, was equally scathing. Rarely in more than a decade of war reporting have I seen such deliberate destruction, such disrespect for human life, she wrote. But neither she nor anyone else could have seen it. The deliberate destruction had not taken place. No adequate apologies were ever offered. It's not just the world's foremost liberal paper, one of the world's most recognisable actresses that were weaponised. Supermodel Bella Hadid claimed that Israel invaded a Palestinian refugee camp and massacred 9 people, including an elderly woman, when in truth the incursion was a counter-terror operation and 7 of the dead were Hamas and Islamic Jihad gunmen. And who can forget the BBC headline, "Palestinian shot dead after Jerusalem attack kills 2, as if the main outrage was that the Israeli police shot the rampaging double murderer. The fact that Israelophobic propaganda could exert so much influence, even over the supposedly even-handed BBC, speaks volumes about its pervasiveness.
So this had nothing to do with, oh my God, we're going to get Yahya Sinwar. In fact, the Israeli intelligence is excellent. As you can see, they blew up the walkie-talkies, the pagers, etc. They knew where Sinwar was the whole time. It was an accident, as Mossad just explained, because they didn't want to kill him.
This is the idiocy of Cenk. He will always put down to conspiracy what could just be put down to, reasonable expected failure. And I think there's been a kind of a there has been something of a industry of this ever since 9/11. There's been all kinds of 9/11 truthers, peddling conspiracies about well, America must have wanted to let 9/11 happen, or they must have wanted to let bin Laden get away. They must have known in advance it was coming. How did they not respond so quickly on the day? And I think what often they don't understand, or at least they pretending not to understand, is when it comes to 9/11, I don't think it had ever been the case before that hijackings would lead to, would be so rapidly followed up by and actually use the plane as a missile, as an offensive. Weaponize it to, actually attack America. Usually when a hijacking happens, you tend to wait for the plane to land and the hijackers to list their demands. That's usually what happens in a hijacking. So they were presumably it was presumably for them should have been a waiting game of, well, we're waiting for them to make their demands. But in this instance, the unprecedented happened and no one was prepared for this, because it was such an unprecedented terrorist attack. But ever since then, of course, it's kind of lent conspiracy theorists like Cenk to say, oh, well, America must have known 9/11 was going to happen, and they must have deliberately allowed bin Laden to escape Afghanistan to justify a war in Iraq. And, you know, when Michael Moore popularised this in a big way with Fahrenheit 9/11, and do I even need to bother debunking him? I don't think I do. It's it's basically the grievance of convenience. It's convenient grievance. It's almost making it up as he goes along. That he's doing what Michael Moore was doing. Kind of making it up as he goes along to justify why the war aims aren't genuine, why the failures so far have been deliberate, and it's absurd, really. I mean, Israel is facing 7 fronts in this war. Why the hell would it even waste time on deliberately stalling the solution? Why would it waste time? Why would it be that conspiratorial while it's, facing off against 7, against Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Iran, and Yemen at once, and the Gaza Strip? It's like, if it's facing that many enemies on all fronts, why is it going to have the time to pussyfoot deliberately to allow its enemies to escape so that it can continue to propagate the war? It's fucking ridiculous, really. But Cenk just will not grant this war any validity at all, any legitimacy at all. It has to be, it's being waged deliberately and effectively to justify the civilian collateral that's emerging.
Because he was an excuse. The hostage deal has been on the table since July 2nd. Israel's not taking it. Why? They want to use it as an excuse to absolutely annihilate northern Gaza.
Hostage deal would mean appeasement of a genocidal terrorist group, and therefore encouraging that genocidal terrorist group to think that they can get away with genocidal massacres like the October the 7th massacre. There's good reason to reject the ceasefire deal. If it doesn't include, Hamas disarming completely and surrendering control of Gaza, then there's no point in the ceasefire deal. And also, who says that it's Israel that's stalling the ceasefire deal? Hamas are the ones, there's been plenty of reports of Hamas stalling the ceasefire deal deliberately, and Biden compelling Israel to cooperate with a ceasefire deal that basically just amounts to Hamas messing the Israelis around.
Northern Gaza, and retake it. They're doing past weekend, Netanyahu's party, Likud, did a seminar on how to resettle Gaza.
Well, yeah, I'm sure there is an interest in the former settlers of the Gaza Strip to want to return to the homes they were ripped out of. But why were they ripped out of their homes?
August 15, 2005, one of the most dramatic events in recent Israeli history, which nearly tore the nation apart. An Israeli government plan called the Disengagement is set in motion, a unilateral pulling out of the Gaza Strip. Some 9,000 Israeli citizens pulled from their homes across 21 settlements in Gaza, and 4 northern West Bank settlements to be relocated within the Green Line, in a plan masterminded by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. The decision to leave after 38 years of occupation, sold by leadership to its people as a bid to bolster security for Israelis and lessen the tensions between them and the Palestinians.
Why would Israel remove the settlers in 2005 and abandon the Gaza Strip with some strange master plan, as he puts it, to with it in mind, to with some strange master plan in mind to that one day Hamas will provide the excuse to go back and take the Gaza Strip again, even though they abandoned it in 2005. And we removed the settlers just so we could conspire to 19 years later have an excuse to put them back in the Gaza Strip, gain further sales. It's ridiculous. It's just
אמרו לי, יש לך שבועיים אתה מתגייס. צנחנים. ואז היה כתבה בעיתון בישראל, כל הכבוד, הוא מתגייס לצבא, ואז הזמינו אותו לתוכנית טלוויזיה, תוכנית בוקר, ושאלתי שאלה, ואם ישלחו אותי לפנות מתנחלים, בדיוק היה התנתקות ב-2005.
זה מתי שהוציאו את היהודים מעזה?
מקוש קטיף, נווה דקלים כן מעזה, כן. מקוש קטיף, יהודה ושומרון, כן. נווה דקלים. ואז אמרתי, רגע, בואו נעשה סדר. אם אני מתגייס לצבא, אני שומע על המדינה ועל האזרחיה, אני לא מפנה מתנחלים, אני לא הורס בית כנסת, אני לא מצא אנשים מתים מהקברות שלהם, והתנתקות זה סכנה למדינת ישראל. זה המשפט שלי. זה סכנה למדינת ישראל. הצבא קשור אליי, ביי, תודה רבה, אתה לא מתגייס. כאילו אני מתחיל לעשות בעיות, ואז עשיתי שלט, 3 מטר על 2 מטר, ושהבא הפלסטינאי שהתגייר, תתנו להם, תקבלו. אמרו, מה נקבל? מה ניתן? תתנו להם שטחים, את הקוש קטיף, נווה דקלים, משם תקבלו טילים וקסאמים. אתה מה אמרו לי? שאני ימני קיצוני, שאני גזען, שאני שונא ערבים.
זה נכון?
לא, הם לא הבינו, פשוט הם מספרים את הסיפור חיים שלי, מה מלמדים את הילדים שם, איך מגדלים את הילדים שם. כל דבר שאתה נותן להם, אתה משלם על זה במחיר מאוד יקר. הסכם אוסלו, זה הכי פשוט. כולם היו בעד, רובם היה בעד, הסכם אוסלו, שיהיה שלום. אני זה שנולדתי ברצועת עזה בח'אן יונס. הייתי נגד. למה הייתי נגד? כי אני מכיר אותם. אני יודע מה מסוגל לעשות. התנתקות. אני הייתי נגד. כי אני מכיר אותם.
This is all about grabbing land. It is a war of colonial war of conquest where Israel is Goliath and crushing the defenseless Palestinians and Lebanese so they can grab more of their land.
If they're so defenseless, why has it taken the best part of a year to defeat Hamas? If Hamas are that powerless, then they should have been easily crushed, shouldn't they? And if they're so defenseless, how come they've got hostages that they can shoot in the head? The defenseless ones here are the hostages and the victims of October the 7th. They were killed. They weren't able to defend themselves. In that situation, they were the powerless ones against, powerful Hamas.